So again, for those who know how AI works and so on, this is a very overview intro, just so that you understand there's nothing to be scared about, and there is all to be excited about. So the next slide. Again, is an overview of how expert systems in the 80s or even in the late 70s were what people considered AI. And one system in particular named demysing, which was to diagnose and treat bacterial infections, goes in any encyclopedia and textbooks as one of the prime examples of AI of that era. Then in the 90s and 2000s neural networks, I'll put shallow here because they were not deep neural networks that we use today. Then they were kind of abandoned. There was a little less work, but still classifiers and support vector machines. But the last decade brought back neural networks, and this time deep neural networks, and because the computational power allowed for that. And of course, we're now in the era of generative AI, the generative adversarial network. So I'll explain a little bit how that works. In the 30s and 40s are for you to develop the new techniques and apply to medicine. So very exciting times to come. AI Medicine, New England Journal even created a subsidiary journal named New England Journal AI, and it's coming up, if not yet. There's a lot to be said about it. There's a lot of things that need to be evaluated before AI can be used routinely in certain areas of healthcare. JAMA also has a special issue in communications about it. I draw your attention to the title AI in Clinical Practice, AI in Gaslighting, AI Hallucinations, and Generative AI Potential. Catchy title, and we will see what they're talking about later in the presentation. But let me get back to the first chatbot, 1966. And as you know, there weren't even monitors in computers at the time. Can you see the paper coming out? The computer, that was the user interface, just words. And if you want to have fun, there are emulators today of this ELIZA system. So I used one yesterday. I was just going through it, like, would it matter to you? It does kind of a conversation with you. And I say, well, what comes to mind when you ask that? And I answer that you're a bot. What makes you think I am a bot? You sound like one. You're not really talking about me, are you? Yes, I understand. Where were you born? What suggests that I was born? So, and interestingly, that there was a picture of this also in images. And that same sentence, you're not really talking about me, are you? It comes in another conversation, meaning it was all scripted, right? And depending on how you ask something, it would fill in. And it was all done with a rule-based kind of idea. So very restricted. But remember, the computers at the time were very restricted as well. So in the 70s and 80s, like I said, these expert systems for medicine started to come up. CASNet was for glaucoma, Mysing was for bacterial infections, Internet was for the whole internal general medicine. I mean, can you believe it? They were trying to, again, diagnose the disease. They were all rule-based, or was what they later called knowledge-based, but they were not data-driven. And I stole this picture online from a DEC System 20. This was one of the, this dinosaur computers that had apparently 500K words. That's memory. That was the big thing at the time that only big universities had. And so on. That's where this expert systems came up. Again, very ancient history of AI, but it is there. Yale had its presence in artificial intelligence as well at the time about exactly this conversational systems and cognitive science related activities. After a certain time, it disappeared. So just to say that there is the ancient AI, there is the medium AI, and now is what we consider modern, which when you are my age, it will be ancient as well. So just think about this. What are data-driven models? This is a different thing. It's not that you create a rule and say if this happens and then do this or that. It's different. You give a lot of examples, and then it extrapolates to new examples. And the easiest way to think about it is linear regression that you learned in high school, right? You give a lot of points, it creates a line for you, and then when you have a new data, you try to see where in the line it would fit, and you estimate the answer. So that's a data-driven system, because you're giving a lot of examples. It's creating a model, in this case, a line, right? A linear model, and you're able then to come up with an example that didn't exist before and estimate what the answer would be. So that's a data-driven model, very different than a rule, right? Of course, you could in this case make it into a rule. They take the input, multiply by the X, add another number, and then you read out the answer. But it's a data-driven, meaning the line can only be as good as the points that you put in there, right? And if there were outliers, there are things you forgot, it won't capture those, and it will make wrong estimations for those. At the bottom is a 2D example. So you have two variables, x1 and x2, and you're still trying to estimate y. And many times it's classifiers. So if y is above this number, then it's disease. And if it's below this number, there's no disease. So again, data-driven systems that you get a lot of examples with the gold standard. That's called supervised learning. You select a model and tune its parameters until it fits the data. Apply the model to previously unseen cases, and then the model will estimate. So the principle is exactly the same for deep neural networks that do classification, right? So by the same reasoning, they will only be as good as the examples you gave them. But now let's see what differs from a regression model and from others. But let me go a little bit of what we do daily, which is descriptive statistics about things. So you of course, if you have a descriptive statistics, and this is univariate for a single variable. So in this case was the first COVID cases that we gather in a large network. And yes, you could do estimates too. If a patient of age between 71 and 80 comes in, what is the mortality rate? Well, probably 17%. It was very high in the beginning of the pandemic, right? So again, it's one variable kind of telling you what to expect if a patient with that characteristic comes up. As you can tell, it was in this real case estimated that mortality of Hispanic patients would be lower, and it was, just on this univariate statistics, where you were hearing in the news and everywhere that it's perhaps is quite the opposite, that there was higher mortality in certain ethnicities. And that's why we don't use univariate models, right? We wouldn't ever use. And we, in fact, do multivariate models in which you adjust for a lot of other factors. And in this case, just the idea here is a logistic regression, which can be called statistical learning as opposed to machine learning. And what you see here, just to interpret what is below, the real factor was age. And the other factors after you adjust for age were not a big deal in mortality, meaning the Hispanic patients were probably younger than the other patients. Therefore, the other patients had a higher mortality because they were older. But once you adjust for age, that is no longer the case, right? So that's a regression, logistic regression. A lot of you use that. Do a lot of you know how it is estimated? The coefficients of a logistic regressions are estimated. A few of you will know. Others will say, well, we just trust it. Yeah, just trust it. Because it's a trial and error algorithm. So in many ways, very similar to what you do in neural networks. You try one thing, put too high, then put too low, and so on. So the parameters are estimated that way. They can start completely random, and then they get adjusted as you show examples and you iterate. So several iterations for a logistic regression estimation, which is the same thing for neural networks, except that there are many more parameters involved than just the coefficients. The other difference is coefficients you usually can interpret. It's a positive coefficient with a very, and it's high magnitude, then that influences the outcome more once the inputs are standardized. Whereas in the neural network, it's not calculated that way. It's different. So the explainability of the model with the interpretability is a little bit different. So I'll give you an example here, and again, those who know this just ignore for a while. But it's an example with two inputs only. I said, well, let's not do one variable, let's do two variables. And I just represented the picture what a logistic regression model is. You have inputs, a patient of age 34, and with a lab value of 4. Then you have the coefficients, 0.6 and 0.7, that get multiplied by those inputs. And then you have a sum, right? I put a sigma here to signify the sum. And that sum is put into a sigmoid function that is represented here at the bottom right. And then you read out the estimate. So very similar to the linear regression, except that you're bound by 0 and 1. That's what this function does, right? So this is a logistic regression, and I'm showing in pictures on the left-hand side that you can separate the green examples from the red examples to a certain extent, right? Not perfect, but you can. So keep that in mind. This is the logistic regression. If I move the title and say, oh, it's a neural network, you say, no, it's the same. It is the same, except that neural networks, you can add intermediary layers, and that's what makes them different. So again, just to recap, good for interpretation, works well only for certain problems, right? Because in here, as you can tell, the line is pretty good to separate. But all you have is a line in this case. In certain cases would not be as good. There are few parameters, easy to compute. That's why it's the first thing we used and still use. But it has limitations. So in here, I just put the example again with 3 variables, and then you read out the probability of dying, right? It's an example only. So logistic regression are very common in medicine. If you go to the electronic health record, there are some that can be made active, and you can calculate a ton of things like probability of sepsis, severity in certain cases. So there are a lot of options in there. So all these models, again, are data driven. So someone trained them with real data, 3 gold standard outcomes, and got to those parameters, the coefficients. Once trained, the coefficients and constants do not change, so it's highly reproducible, right? You know what the coefficients are, you can just reproduce the exact same thing. Some models are proprietary with coefficients not disclosed, but even what was called an executable application, right? Something you can't see inside, but you can see input and output. Even that, it can be and will be highly reproducible. Interpretable, and then again, they're only as good as the data they're trained on, which constitutes a big problem because it's shown over and over that the diversity in training sets does not represent the diversity in the population. So many people are left out of this. However, they're not left out when people estimate their probability of something. And you might be estimating a case that was previously never similar being seen, and the estimate can be very, very wrong. So that's an important thing to think about, not only for AI models, but for statistical models as well that do estimations. So examples here, framing in cardiovascular risk of having a cardiovascular event in the next 5-10 years, pretty common to use. The model for end-stage liver disease is used in liver transplantation queues, and it's not first come, first serve. It's whoever is more severe according to this index would get a matching liver first. And so highly impactful in terms of the healthcare. So why neural networks then? So here in examples 2, remember I said that in this 2 variable case, you can only use a line by the rules of a logistic regression, by the constraints of that function. However, you can see here, hopefully, that if you had more flexibility in using that line and making it not a line, but a curve, you would separate the samples better, right? We're in agreement here that the errors made on the left-hand side are many more numerous than the ones done on the right-hand side, right? And you say, well, then why don't we use this more flexible things all the time? There's several reasons why we don't use them all the time, but one of them is that you can be so flexible that you can create a very curvy separation boundary there, and that might be only applicable to your training set, and it doesn't generalize to the rest of it. So someone came up and said, well, in cases of nonlinear separation, as in this one, logistic regression will not handle. And then the statistician says, well, yes, you can, you just introduce interaction variables. And yes, that's true, but you have to think of all the interactions you need to put there. So it's not that simple. Would be more interpretable though. So no doubt about it. It's a trade-off, right? Everything in life is a trade-off. So what I'm presenting here using the same color schema as before is how you can think of an artificial neural network, in this case with only one hidden layer, as if it were a composition of logistic regression models, but of course you don't have the gold standard for the hidden layer. You just don't, right? You know the outcome and you know the inputs, you don't have that intermediate. So how do you do that? Well, you do the same thing, you do trial and error. So you start with a random set of parameters and then you keep iterating until the inputs match, the outputs match what the gold standard is for that case. And you have to have many more cases because you have many more parameters, right? So that this rule of thumb is you should always have, at least 10 observations per parameter. I would say you probably need many more. But in any case, you see how many more parameters we have here, right? They're not called coefficients, they're called weights, but it's the same process that you do. You multiply the weight by the input and then you sum them up, go to this other layer, pass it on a function, and then do the same to the output. So in that case, you can see, well, artificial neural networks and logistic regression models are kind of the same, right? Because they are, except that you can't interpret the coefficients the same way as you did before, right? So there are other techniques to estimate the value of a certain input variable, for example, but I won't get through this details right now. And just say this is a shallow network. And why is it shallow? Because it just had one hidden layer. And why it had to be shallow? Because we didn't have the computers to do more layers in this massive number of examples. So for many years, a decade, that's where artificial neural networks stood. So again, they work well, even in those cases that are called non-linearly separable. data, they have more parameters to learn, right? To learn the data. They are more flexible, they're computationally more expensive, less interpretive, but again, one item to demystify, they are reproducible. Once you estimate the model, you lock them up, lock all those weights, that's your model, right? It's completely reproducible. So if you don't keep retraining and re-estimating, whatever you locked up with, and that's what the FDA will ask to be done when you're trying to commercialize your model, then they are reproducible. So there's nothing to fear, as some do, that every time you get a different answer, it's just not the case. So deep learning, how again, I just put 2 layers here, the real deep, we get several layers and becomes this very flexible classifier in this case, but there are, of course, many other uses of neural network. And I just put here that the way it works, you start with random weights, you propagate, do those multiplications, get an outcome. If it's too high, you send a message, oh, decrease them a little bit. And then you keep doing this until you find that it's not changing anymore. And that's because you achieved whatever's achievable. And again, several details that I will bypass regarding to this. Data-driven models then, again, machine learning or statistical learning, it's kind of the same thing. It's just details about weights and coefficients and things like that, and this link function that I explained. Every medical specialty has hundreds of examples of predictive models for diagnosis and prognosis of disease. So just as yesterday, I was attending a presentation by a dermatologist, and she declared AI classification of melanoma photos, just the photos, outperforms humans dermatologists since 2017. So we got to live with it. Of course, the dermatologist's job is not to read a static one photo, and that's of course why the machine learning does better. But again, if you think of both combined, then you have a powerful advisor, I would say, or something to think about. Classifiers, the ones that I showed, that you estimate some binary output of 0 or 1, dead or alive, and so on. They are the most common types. If you go into literature, the medical literature, you will find a whole lot of them. They're called discriminative models because they discriminate the dead and the alive, or recurrence of cancer, not recurrence of cancer at a certain time, and so on. So very, very common. Now, I didn't even highlight any here because there are so many of those. We use some of this models. This is a center that we started on admixture science and technology and for genomics for everyone. And essentially, we're building models that estimate a trait given genetic determinants plus social determinants. So it is my belief that self-reported race and ethnicity are difficult constructs to use. Genetics is a little bit easier. I mean, it's more objective in certain ways. But if you take that without the social determinants, diet, income, environment, then you're missing out a whole lot of things, which is why, except for very simple genetic associations, some others are not there yet. So we need to combine these two things. And on top of it, well, do you know how many genes do we have that could have variants? What's the current count? Well, it's 20,000, right? Because at some point it was much more, and then it's like Pluto, it got demoted. So let's say we have 20,000 parameters here, which is much more because the variant can be anywhere in the gene, it can be a different variant. But let's say just we have 20,000. How many observations we need to have? No, it's not just 200,000, it's millions. We definitely need a whole lot to be able to build a good model. And remember also for genetic studies, the underrepresentation of certain groups is just astounding at this point. So there are several initiatives to try to fix the recruitment and the utilization of such data. And one of them that one of our faculty members here, sitting right there, is working to help is how do we compute with 1 million genomes from the Million Veteran Program and what will be 1 million genomes from the All of Us research program. Those two programs do not allow data to come out of their enclaves, right? So we need to develop algorithms that actually do all that I said we need to do in terms of estimating parameters. We have to do in a distributed way. And there, again, folks who study not only how to do this, but how to do it in a secure way to preserve privacy. So very exciting things happening in this area right now. But now let me get to one of the criticisms of deep learning. It says deep learning has imagination problems. It's not creative. It doesn't come up with new things, right? So yeah, that's old AI. It's not generative AI. Generative AI comes with new things, and that's exciting, and that's why we are so entertained by the possibilities of generative AI. So let's think about generative AI for a second, and then I will describe what is behind the scenes again in a very, very overviewish kind of way. So generative adversarial networks, they make fake data indistinguishable from real data. That's their objective, right? So in this example here from NVIDIA, you have source photographs, and then AI creates fake people out of those images, and they're in the columns here, right? So these are just fake portraits of people. They're pretty good, right? You would say, yeah, this look like real people, right? Because they trained it well, and that's how it was. How is a generative adversarial network trained? What is a generative adversarial network? And it's a very clever extension to what the discriminative or the classifier neural network, deep neural network that I talked about actually is. And how does that work? There are two components. The discriminator network classifies, and I already told you how that works, right? With those parameter estimations and so on. But now there's another component, which is the generator of the data. And the two things are because the generator is inventing data, and the discriminator is saying, oh yeah, this is real. No, this is fake. No, this is real, this is fake. And according to how well the generator is doing, the discriminator, will get less and less certain, right? At one point, it can't tell this is fake or this is real. And at that point, you reach the point where your fake, whatever, portrait just can be fool anybody, right? And that's the principle of the generative adversarial network. And you may say, well, how it produces the data. So this, I got this example, and I had to modify it a little bit because I didn't quite agree with what it was saying, but at least they had the components out there. So you have source data, and you extract the main components. It's like the model is thinking, yeah, it has to have a nose, and the nose is here. It has to have this. There are different types of noses, and kind of constructs picture. It might construct very fake ones that you don't believe in, right? And so it's an iterative process. It generates from a known distribution, from embeddings, or from whatever is that kind of summarizes the main aspects of your source, and then generates new data from it. So the whole point is to generate new things, right? These fake things that look like real. And then it generates it. Then you mix with real data, and then you send to the discriminating network this deep neural network that I talked about, and it tries to classify into fake or into real. And until it's doing a good job, you're not creating good fake data, right? Because it's knowing it. But at some point, it's unclear, and then it's where the fake data look real. So again, it produces a probability of fake, and then once you start getting everyone into it's 50-50, then you are achieve your goal. So that's for training. And why this large language models, for example, can only be done by large companies and so on, is because this takes a ton of computation, right? That most universities won't have. And so it's millions of parameters, maybe billions, and not everyone can afford to go into that. But we've all seen examples of how fake stuff really fools us. From the ELIZA dialogue, we have evolved quite a bit to get ChatGPT to produce things that look real, right? But they're generated. So once you train the model, then you can get rid of the discriminator and essentially just export your model, again, reproducible, it is reproducible, to the application that wants to couple with it. So for example, electronic health record systems, such as the one used here and in many other academic medical centers, do now have the functionality of embedding ChatGPT to answer patients' questions, not without supervision of the real doctor, but for the doctor to say, yes, I agree with this response, and then the response goes to the patient. So it's not a chat bot, it isn't, it's mediated, but I'm told it produces very good answers, in most cases, but it then produces hallucinations in some other cases, right? So whoever is approving has to be very careful about, yeah, this is great, this is not great. But then in a way, and people complain about this, remember I said the generative networks came because of the lack of imagination of the deep neural networks. They came to generate fake. So now you complain that it generates too fake, and so on. So it's not exactly fair that this happens. But it's important to note that why it generates a fake thing that looks real. Well, because in the training process, no one was able to show the counter examples, right? So the training data have problems. They don't have those examples of that we know it's fake, but it doesn't know. So the whole thing about training these models is super important. The other thing I wanted to emphasize, another problem currently is because these models can only be trained in large companies and so on, even when you correct the notes and say, well, this I need to correct it. So that information is not feeding back because of privacy, right? So the model will continue to do that, and it will not auto-correct or unless it's retrained somehow. But to retrain it, you need the company. So now we get into this issue, right, of how to go about it. So very interesting ethical issues as well. I would say I used the PowerPoint to generate, look how it came with kidney injury. It still doesn't do a great job. So AI has its limitations, I would say. Again, just to conclude that our section came to, again, fill some gaps in research, service and training in the area of biomedical informatics and data science, and of course, AI medicine being one of them. And again, I don't want to read everything, but there are a whole lot of things that we came here and we are very excited to to offer. We have new people. I put my areas of interest on the outside of the circle. On the inside, the new people we hired in several different fronts to work with this very different aspects of biomedical informatics that need to exist in order to go full circle from research all the way to implementation. I asked each one to produce one slide for me, or I summarized when they said more than one. And again, I will go very quickly through them, but just so that you understand that people are doing different things. Some are MDs with a particular domain problem. Some are methods people with, motivated by a particular biomedical application. And I'll make the slides available. Probably just remove the pictures that are proprietary, and I just used for illustration. Dr. Brandt is working primarily with the VA data sets, and has again a lot of interests on particular medical domain areas. Dr. Meeker is our Chief Research Information Officer, very interested in behavioral economics in the learning healthcare system. And what is that? Well, when you commit to certain actions, do you really follow up with them? What are the effects of this learning healthcare system, which is, we have all this data. Are we learning from this data? In improving our practices as a result. Dr. Hartley, and among several activities, very into global health technologies, global health, federated learning, again with data in specific countries, and working towards that. And she will launch also an exchange student program with students from Africa and Switzerland. Dr. Isco is an emergency physician who was working with Drs. Melnick, Taylor, Hauser on a variety of projects as well. Dr. Kate Chung is a professor in BITS and is on knowledge graphs, so more on the methodologies in organization of data. Dr. Shu focuses on natural language processing for biomedical clinical notes, which is highly specialized. And also he gave a presentation on large language models, and you might have seen that already. Dr. Nahom works with Dr. Hua Shu, again, in several projects related that have a strong natural language processing component. Dr. Zenos Papadimetris, who is out there, is our imaging expert, works in several areas, and again, AI in imaging, as you know, it's a very robust area. Dr. Jinyu Chen works both in NLP and in image analysis, and I put here, it's his picture there, not me. He wanted to be presented that way. I preserved his intent in here, but it's working primarily with ophthalmology images at the moment. Dr. Hong Cho is also here next to the projector, and again, a lot of work in federated learning, fairness, and genomics. So the intersection of computational biology and computer science, biomedical informatics. Dr. Ji-Hong Kim is both in bioinformatics, as shown here, particularly in the specific areas of Kawasaki disease and MIS-C, and also in phenotyping. And then we added a slide that the health system also has several opportunities if you're interested in research in there, in care pathways, and again, different communication strategies, EHR optimization, which is always a hot topic, and alerts to surgeons, and so on. So that, as I mentioned, there are so many applications that it should be, it's like almost intimidating because there's so much to do and then you have to pick one area and kind of partner with somebody. So with that, I think we leave a little bit of questions. This is acknowledgements to our funding sources and so on. But after this, I think I'm done with our part primarily. So any question or comment on, or those who know the area well can say, oh, you kind of goofed on that slide. That's okay too, because it's mostly to, again, present to you that there is no reason to fear that AI will take over and with all those things. We are in complete control of what it does, right? So we just need to understand it well, so not to be fooled by the propaganda of, we can do everything, just give us all your data and we can, solve all your problems. It doesn't work like that, especially patient data.